The words leave his mouth and land somewhere behind your ribs. You smile, say something forgettable, and walk away. 3 hours later, you are washing a dish that is already clean, replaying the sentence, building the answer you should have given, losing an argument to a man who is not even in the room anymore. This is not really about the dish or the man or what he said. It is about the fact that a single sentence rented space in your head for an entire afternoon, unpaid, uninvited, and you let it in. You call this thinking. It might be closer to being lived by your own mind instead of living through it. What follows will not teach you to think positive or breathe deeper. It will show you the exact mechanism by which a thought becomes a mood becomes a decision, and a decision becomes the shape of a life, and how to put your hand on that mechanism instead of being run by it. Here is the part almost no one tells you. The moment that man's sentence hijacked your afternoon, you were not out of control. You were using the exact same law that, aimed differently, would have made you free. The problem was never that your mind is too powerful. The problem is that you have been aiming it at random your entire life, based on the book The Kybalion by 3 initiates, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Weather You Mistook for Yourself. You wake up before the alarm again, not because you are rested, because some part of you was already awake, running a loop it started hours ago and never got permission to close. You lie there in the dark, and you can feel it, a low hum behind your forehead, the residue of a conversation, a decision, a worry that has no new information to offer and keeps offering it anyway. You call this a busy mind. You call it stress, or overthinking, or just how you are wired. Those words are comfortable because they ask nothing of you. A wiring problem is not your fault and not your job to fix. But sit with the sensation for 1 more second before you reach for the phone. Notice that the loop has a rhythm. It rises, peaks, and falls, then rises again, on a schedule you never set and rarely question. That rhythm is not random. It is a signal that something is operating you, and you have mistaken its operation for who you are. Here is the first thing worth naming plainly, without the softening. Your mind is not a passive mirror reflecting a day back at you at the end of it. It is closer to weather. It has fronts, pressure systems, storms that build for reasons that trace back further than the thing you think triggered them. You do not control the weather by declaring it should be sunny. You learn to read the pressure before the storm arrives, and you learn what you can do inside it once it does. Almost nobody teaches you this distinction, so you spend years trying to argue with your own sky. Think about the last time a comment from someone, offered in passing, maybe even meant kindly, took up residence in you for an entire evening. You washed a dish that was already clean. You rehearsed a response to a conversation that had already ended, refining a sentence for an audience that had left the room. That evening you were not choosing your thoughts. You were hosting them, and they were charging rent. This is the pattern this book exists to interrupt. The quiet, constant confusion between what moves through your mind and who you are underneath it. Most people never separate the two. They assume the loop is them, so when the loop is loud, they believe they are broken. When the loop is quiet, they believe they are fine. Neither is accurate. You are the one who notices the loop. The loop is not you. That single sentence, once it actually lands, changes what you do the next time a stranger's comment tries to rent space in your head. Consider 2 people who receive the exact same piece of criticism at work. One replays it for 3 days, loses sleep, and starts a second, angrier argument with a boss who is not in the room. The other reads it, feels the sting for about 90 seconds, decides what, if anything, needs to change, and moves on with the rest of the day intact. The event was identical. The internal weather system produced 2 entirely different climates. Nobody would say the second person simply doesn't care. What they have instead is a different relationship to the mechanism doing the producing. There is a difference worth sitting with here, because it is easy to blur, and it changes everything once you see it clearly. Reacting is what the mind does when a thought arrives and takes the wheel before you notice it climbed in. Responding is what happens when you notice the thought arrive, let it finish its sentence, and then decide what your hands and your voice will actually do. Reacting feels like speed. Responding feels, at first, like a half-second of nothing. That half-second is the entire distance between a life that runs you and a life you run. You have felt that half-second before, even if nobody pointed it out to you at the time. The moment right before you send the text you will regret. The moment right before you raise your voice at someone who did not deserve it. The moment right before you say yes to something you already know will cost you a weekend you needed. In every one of those moments, there was a sliver of space where another option was technically available. You didn't take it, not because it wasn't there, but because nobody had ever shown you it existed, or shown you how thin and how real that sliver actually is. Notice what happens in your chest right now as you read that. Maybe a small tightening, a private catalog starting to assemble itself of every time you missed that sliver this month alone. Let it assemble. You are not being asked to judge the list. You are being asked to notice that a list is even possible, which means the moments were visible, which means they can become visible again, earlier, before the wheel gets taken. Here is a distinction that will matter for the rest of this journey, one you likely have never put into these exact words before, though you have lived the difference 1,000 times. There is a difference between a thought and a command. A thought is information arriving uninvited, carrying a mood or a memory or a fear. A command is what happens when you treat that thought as an instruction you are required to obey immediately, without question, the moment it shows up. Most people were never taught the difference, so they treat every thought that arrives with enough emotional force as an order. Anger arrives, and they mistake it for a command to raise their voice. Doubt arrives, and they mistake it for a command to quit. The thought was only ever information. You added the command yourself, quietly, so many times that it started to feel automatic, and automatic started to feel true. This matters more than it sounds like it should because the cost of missing this distinction does not show up all at once. It shows up as a decade. It shows up as the version of you that keeps taking the same job, the same argument, the same late-night spiral, and calling it personality instead of pattern. Patterns feel like identity from the inside. That is exactly what makes them expensive, and exactly what makes them invisible until someone hands you a way to see them from the outside. You are not going to fix this by trying harder to think positive thoughts, and nothing here is going to ask you to. Trying harder at the level of content, swapping one thought for a nicer one, leaves the actual mechanism untouched. What you are about to learn operates one level beneath the content of any single thought. It operates at the level of the current that decides which thoughts get amplified into moods, and which moods get amplified into decisions, and which decisions, repeated enough times without anyone questioning them, quietly become the shape of an entire life. That current has a name and a logic, and it has been described with precision far longer than most people realize. You have been living inside its rules the entire time, the same way you have been living inside gravity without ever needing to study physics to fall correctly. The difference is that gravity does not respond to attention. This current does. The moment you can see it operating, even for half a second, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, something in the loop loosens that has never loosened before. The alarm has not gone off yet. You are still lying in the dark, still feeling the low hum behind your forehead. But you are noticing it now instead of simply being it. And that noticing, small and almost embarrassing in how simple it sounds, is the first thread of a rope you are going to learn to hold with both hands. Chapter 2. The Substitute Question. Your friend tells you the same story about her marriage for the fourth time this year. Nothing in the story has changed. Only her tone has, a little more tired each time, a little more rehearsed, like a scene an actor has performed so often the words no longer touch anything underneath them. You listen, you nod, and somewhere in the middle of her sentence you think quietly, almost too quiet to admit even to yourself. She already knows. She has known for a while. And still, next month, she will tell it again. You are not thinking this about her because you are cruel. You're thinking it because it is obviously true from the outside, the way every pattern is obvious from the outside. What you are not doing in that same moment is turning the same clarity toward the story you have been telling yourself on repeat for years. The one you have polished so smooth it barely sounds like a complaint anymore. It sounds like a fact. That is precisely how you can tell it is not one. Denial has a reputation for looking like refusal, like someone standing in front of evidence with their arms crossed, insisting the sky is a different color. That version exists, but it is rare, and it is not the version running your life. The far more common version does not refuse to look. It looks constantly, carefully, and still somehow never quite arrives at the conclusion that would require it to change anything. This is not stupidity. It is a kind of skill, developed over years, so refined you no longer notice you are using it. Consider how this skill actually operates. You feel a familiar dread on Sunday night, the specific weight of knowing Monday is coming. You could ask what exactly about your work produces that weight. Instead, the mind offers a substitute question almost instantly, one that feels productive without costing anything. What should I make for dinner? The substitute question is not random. It is chosen by a part of you working faster than conscious thought, precisely because it is answerable, and precisely because answering it will use up the evening before the real question gets any air. This is functional denial. Functional because it works. It gets you through the evening. It gets you through the year. The dread never disappears, but it never fully arrives either, and a life can run for a remarkably long time on a feeling that is never allowed to finish forming. Here is a distinction worth holding on to, because the two get confused constantly, and confusing them is exactly what keeps the pattern alive. There is a difference between not knowing and not letting yourself know. Not knowing is innocent. It is a gap in information, closed the moment new information arrives. Not letting yourself know is active, ongoing labor, performed by someone who already has enough information and is spending real effort keeping it from crossing a particular line. You can tell which one you are dealing with by how much energy the topic requires to avoid. True ignorance is weightless. You don't think about what you don't know. Functional denial is heavy. It takes maintenance. It needs the substitute questions, the extra glass of wine, the specific brand of busyness that fills exactly the hours a real conversation would have taken. Notice, for a moment, what you reach for when a difficult thought starts to surface. Maybe it's your phone. Maybe it's a task that suddenly feels urgent, one that was not urgent an hour ago. Maybe it's a version of tiredness that arrives right on schedule, the moment the topic gets close. None of these reaches are accidents. They are well-practiced exits, built over years of small emergencies, each one reasonable enough on its own that you never had to notice the pattern connecting them. Ask yourself something honestly, without rushing to answer it. What is the one sentence you would have to say out loud, to one specific person, that you have been arranging your entire week to avoid saying? Sit with the discomfort of that question for a second before moving on. That discomfort is not a malfunction. It is the exact edge where functional denial does its work. And simply locating the edge, without stepping over it yet, is already more than most people ever do. There is a reason this mechanism is so hard to catch in yourself specifically, even when you can spot it instantly in your friend's fourth retelling. The mind that would need to notice the denial is the same mind performing it. You cannot ask your own blind spot to describe its shape, because the very talent that created the blind spot is the talent currently in charge of the description. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is the standard architecture of every human mind. And the people who eventually see through their own patterns do not do it through more willpower or more honesty in the abstract. They do it because something or someone from outside the loop hands them a mirror angled differently than the one they already own. Think about the cost of this in ordinary, specific terms, not in the vague language of self-improvement. A woman spends 6 years in a job that stopped teaching her anything in year 2, because the substitute question, "Do I have enough saved to leave?" is easier to keep unanswered than the real one, which is whether this work has anything left to give her. A man watches his father's health decline and tells himself there is still time for the conversation they have never had, because there is always, technically, still time, right up until there is not. Denial rarely costs you the dramatic collapse. It costs you the quiet years, the ones that could have been spent differently, spent while there was still room to choose. You might expect the antidote here to be some call to radical honesty, an instruction to simply stop lying to yourself starting today. That instruction has never worked for anyone, and it is not what is being offered. Willing yourself into more honesty is like willing yourself into more oxygen. The mechanism does not respond to force applied at the level of intention. It responds to something quieter and stranger. The simple, repeated act of noticing the substitute question the instant it appears, without immediately answering it, without immediately judging yourself for reaching for it. Just noticing, the way you would notice a familiar smell in a room you thought was empty. That noticing does not resolve anything by itself. It is not supposed to yet. What it does is put a small crack in a wall that has been load-bearing for a very long time. And a crack, once it exists, has a way of finding the rest of the structure, whether you go looking for it or not. Your friend will probably tell you the story again next month. You will listen again, and this time, somewhere in the middle of her sentence, you might notice your own substitute question rising to meet hers, right on schedule, dressed as concern for her, arriving exactly in time to keep you from asking what story you have been telling on repeat, in a voice so practiced by now it barely sounds like you anymore. Chapter 3. The Mirror. You read as a window. You have felt it in rooms before you could have explained it. You walk into a meeting already braced for disappointment, and the meeting disappoints you. You walk into a first date convinced you are too much for anyone, and somewhere in the second hour you say something too loud, too fast, too much, and watch it land exactly as you predicted it would. You have called this bad luck. You have called it a string of coincidences. You have never quite called it what it is, because no one ever handed you the word for it. Here is the word: correspondence. The idea that whatever is happening on the inside of you, in the part no one else can see, tends to show up matched on the outside, in the part everyone can. Not as magic, as mechanism. A room does not disappoint you because rooms are cruel. A room disappoints you because you walked in already scanning for the proof. And the mind is extraordinarily good at finding what it went looking for. This might sound at first like an old idea dressed up in new language, the kind of thing people say without meaning much by it. Sit with it a little longer before deciding that. Think about the last time you were in genuinely good spirits, not performing it, actually inhabiting it, and a stranger was rude to you. Notice what happened. The rudeness rolled off you in about 4 seconds. Now think about a day when you were already braced, already tender, and the exact same stranger saying the exact same sentence would have wrecked your entire afternoon. The sentence did not change. The world did not change. The inside changed, and the outside, meeting it, changed with it. This is not a claim that you cause every hardship that happens to you. That version of the idea is cruel, and it is not what is being said here. A car accident is a car accident. A diagnosis is a diagnosis. What corresponds is not every fact of your circumstances. What corresponds is the meaning those facts are allowed to take on inside you, and, over time, the doors that meaning quietly opens or closes. Two people receive the same diagnosis. One organizes their remaining time around fear, and every decision after that point narrows accordingly. The other organizes it around what still matters, and different doors that were always technically there, start to become visible to them for the first time. You already knew this, somewhere below language, long before this sentence gave it a shape. Think about a room you dreaded walking into as a child, a classroom, a family dinner, and how your body knew before your mind did, the tightening in the stomach that arrived seconds before you crossed the threshold. That tightening was not fear of the room. It was a correspondence already active, a rehearsal your inside had already run, waiting for the outside to catch up and confirm it. Here is where the distinction sharpens, and it matters, because people confuse correspondence with control constantly, and the confusion causes real damage. Correspondence is not the same as manifestation in the sense of simply wishing a good outcome into being. That version treats the inside as a wish list, and the outside as a vending machine, and when the vending machine inevitably fails to deliver, people conclude the entire principle was nonsense, or worse, that they personally failed at wishing hard enough. What actually corresponds is not your wish, it is your state. A wish is a sentence. A state is everything underneath the sentence, the posture, the attention, the 1,000 small choices a state produces, without you supervising any of them individually. Consider the way this plays out at a dinner table you know well. Someone arrives already certain the evening will go badly, certain before a single word has been exchanged. Watch what that certainty does. It tightens the shoulders. It shortens the patience. It reads an innocent comment as an attack half a second faster than it would otherwise. None of this is conscious. None of it feels like a decision. And yet by the time dessert arrives, the evening has in fact gone badly, and the person walks away with fresh proof for a belief that was never actually tested, only confirmed by the very state that carried it into the room. There is another confusion worth clearing up here, because it will keep tripping you if it stays vague. Correspondence is not superstition, and the difference is not academic. Superstition assumes an outside force is tracking your behavior and dispensing rewards or punishments accordingly. A black cat, a broken mirror, a number to avoid. Correspondence assumes nothing is watching you at all. It assumes only that a consistent inside produces a consistent outside, the same way a tuning fork struck in one room sets a matching fork vibrating in another. Not because either fork wants anything, but because that is simply what matched frequencies do in proximity to each other. Nobody needs to believe in tuning forks for them to work. You do not need to believe in correspondence for it to keep producing your Tuesdays. Believing in it only changes whether you notice it happening or mistake it, again, for the weather. This is also why willpower alone fails so reliably at changing a pattern like this. Willpower tries to edit the outside directly. The sentence you say at dinner, the smile you force in the meeting, while the state underneath stays exactly as tense as it was. It is the equivalent of muting the tuning fork's ring by hand while the fork itself is still vibrating. The sound stops for as long as your hand stays there and returns the moment you let go, because you addressed the noise and left the vibration untouched. You did not simply have bad luck with people who let you down. You walked toward certain rooms already carrying a state that made letting down more likely to register, more likely to occur, and more likely to be remembered when it did. The pattern was never proof that the world is a specific way. The pattern was a mirror, and you have spent years reading the mirror as a window. Notice, honestly, one relationship or one recurring situation in your life that you have long explained with a phrase like, "This always happens to me." Do not rush to solve it. Just notice for a moment that the phrase itself might be doing more work than the situation is. Always happens implies an external law. What if, instead, it is a correspondence, faithfully repeating itself because the inside producing it has never been examined closely enough to change? There is a cost to skipping this examination, and it compounds quietly. Every year you spend explaining a pattern as bad luck instead of correspondence is a year you spend outsourcing the one variable you actually had access to. The weather, the traffic, other people's moods, none of that was ever yours to adjust. The state you carried into every room this year, that was. Not perfectly, not completely, but far more than the phrase "this always happens to me" ever gave you credit for. This does not resolve today. It is not supposed to. What it gives you is language for something you have been living without words for your entire life. A name for the tightening in the stomach before the threshold, for the room that disappointed you exactly as you expected, for the sentence that wrecked one Tuesday and rolled off you the next. You have been reading the mirror as the window for a long time. Today is the first day you know which one it actually is. Chapter 4. The frequency under the skin. Put your hand flat against your sternum right now if you can, wherever you are reading this. Just for a few seconds. Notice that nothing about your chest is actually still. There is a pulse under the skin, faint, constant, moving whether you pay attention to it or not. You have spent your entire life inside a body that never once stopped vibrating. And you have spent almost none of that life noticing it, because stillness was never the truth. It was only ever the illusion your attention was too busy to see past. This is where the mechanism actually lives, and it is worth being precise about it instead of poetic. Every state you carry, the dread on Sunday night, the tightening before the threshold, the certainty that the evening will go badly before a word is spoken, is not a metaphor. It is a frequency, a specific rate and quality of internal motion, showing up as tension in a jaw, a shallowness in breath, a particular quality of attention that scans faster for threat than for safety. Different states vibrate at different rates. Grief is slow, heavy, low in the body. Anxiety is fast, high, thin, sitting mostly in the chest and throat. Calm is neither fast nor slow so much as even. A rhythm the body can sustain without strain. None of this is invisible once you know to look for it. It has been showing up in your shoulders and your stomach your entire life, uncredited. Here is the part that changes how you relate to your own moods, once it actually lands. A mood is not a fixed object sitting inside you, waiting to be discovered like a stone at the bottom of a bag. A mood is a rate of vibration currently running, which means, by definition, it can run at a different rate. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but sit with what it rules out. It rules out the idea that you are, at your core, an anxious person, or a sad person, or a person who is simply bad at relationships. Those are not cores. Those are frequencies that have been running long enough, uninterrupted, that they started to feel like bedrock. Bedrock does not move. A frequency, however long it has been running, always can. Consider what actually happens in the 10 seconds after someone says something that stings you. The first half second is pure physiology, faster than thought, a genuine shift in your nervous system that you did not choose and cannot prevent. This part is not the mechanism to work with. It is simply weather passing through, and trying to control it directly is like trying to stop a wave with your hand. What happens in the next 9.5 seconds, though, is where the actual mechanism operates, because that is where a specific vibration, once triggered, either gets amplified by attention or left to pass through and settle. You have almost certainly noticed this without naming it. The sting that fades within a minute versus the sting that somehow grows for an hour did not grow because the original comment got worse in memory. It grew because attention kept returning to it, and attention is not neutral. Attention is fuel. Whatever frequency you keep feeding with attention gets louder, not because it deserves to, but because that is simply what happens when energy is repeatedly directed at anything. This is worth distinguishing carefully from suppression, because the two get confused constantly, and the confusion causes real harm. Suppression is refusing to let a vibration register at all, forcing a smile over a jaw that is still clenched, insisting you are fine while the frequency runs unaddressed underneath the performance. Suppression does not lower the vibration. It hides it from view while leaving it fully active. The way turning down a radio's volume knob does nothing to the signal still arriving at the antenna. What actually changes a frequency is not hiding it. It is meeting it directly, letting the initial half-second of physiology move through completely, and then, deliberately, choosing what gets fed with attention afterward. Think about the last time you were unmistakably angry, and it passed within minutes, cleanly, without residue, versus the last time a smaller irritation lingered for the rest of the day. The difference was rarely the size of the trigger. The difference was almost always what happened to the attention immediately afterward. Clean anger gets expressed or named or simply allowed to move through the body as the physical sensation it actually is, and then it is genuinely finished. Lingering irritation gets replayed, rehearsed, narrated to a friend 3 separate times, each retelling another pulse of attention, feeding the exact frequency you were hoping would fade. Here is a long-term consequence worth naming plainly, because it rarely gets said out loud. A person who spends a decade feeding low, heavy frequencies through repeated attention, without ever intending to, does not simply feel bad more often. They become someone whose baseline rate has shifted, whose resting frequency, the one running quietly in the background of an ordinary Tuesday with nothing in particular happening, sits lower than it once did. This is not a character flaw. It is closer to a callus, formed the same way any callus forms, through years of pressure applied to the same spot. And calloused places can still be worked with. They simply take longer, and they require you to notice the pressure being applied in the first place, rather than assuming the callus was always simply the shape of your skin. There is a difference worth drawing here between a vibration and what people casually call a vibe, because the casual word has quietly emptied the real one of its weight. A vibe, in ordinary conversation, is treated as something read from the outside, a mood you pick up walking into a room, gone the moment you leave it. A vibration, in the sense that actually matters here, is not read. It is generated continuously by you, whether or not anyone else is in the room to pick it up. You do not simply catch a bad vibe at work and leave it at the door when you get home. You walk in still running it, and it meets your family, your dinner, your ability to fall asleep at a normal hour, whether or not you ever consciously decided to bring it inside. Picture a man who has spent 15 years in a job that grinds at him in small, forgettable increments, nothing dramatic enough to justify leaving, nothing gentle enough to stop costing him. Each evening he arrives home carrying a frequency he never named, a low simmer just under irritation, and he feeds it without noticing, replaying the day's small insults on the drive home, narrating them again at dinner, checking his phone for the message that will confirm his frustration was justified. None of these individual acts feels like much. Over 15 years, though, that repeated feeding does not simply produce 15 bad days. It produces a baseline, a resting frequency that now hums even on his vacations, even in rooms with nothing wrong in them, because a frequency fed long enough stops needing a reason to keep running. None of this asks you to become a different person by tomorrow. It asks something smaller and stranger. It asks you to notice, the next time a feeling arrives, that you are not looking at a fixed fact about who you are. You are looking at a frequency, currently running, fed or starved by exactly one thing, and that one thing has always been closer to your hand than you were told to believe. Chapter 5. The Ledger No one sends you. Nobody sends you an invoice. That is the part that makes this expensive in a way debt never is. Debt arrives with a number attached, a due date, a letter in the mail that forces you to look at it whether you want to or not. The cost this chapter is about sends nothing. It simply accumulates, quietly, in a currency with no name printed on any bill,
until one ordinary afternoon you look up and notice a decade is gone, and you cannot quite say what you spent it on. Here is the actual mechanism of the cost, stated plainly. Every hour spent feeding a frequency you did not choose, replaying a sting, rehearsing an argument that already ended, bracing for a room before you have even reached it, is an hour not spent building the one thing that would have actually changed your position. Not because you were lazy, because attention is a finite resource, and you had already allocated a large portion of it automatically to maintenance of a pattern you never agreed to run. Think about this in terms an accountant would recognize, because the vagueness of most conversations about this topic is exactly what lets people avoid doing the math. If a familiar dread costs you 45 minutes of genuine presence on an average evening, replaying the day, dreading tomorrow, scrolling to avoid both, that is roughly 270 hours a year. Multiply by a decade and you are looking at something close to 11 full weeks. Gone, not to rest, not to connection, not to anything you would choose if someone had shown you the total in advance. Nobody shows you the total in advance. That is precisely the point. The cost rarely shows up where you are looking either, which is part of what makes it so easy to miss for so long. You do not usually feel the cost of an unexamined pattern as a dramatic loss. You feel it as a low, persistent sense that your life is slightly smaller than it should be, a texture rather than an event, easy to attribute to being tired or busy, or simply how adulthood feels. It rarely announces itself as the pattern's fault because the pattern, by design, has made itself invisible by feeling like personality. The body keeps its own ledger too, separate from the one measured in hours, and it is worth naming plainly instead of leaving it abstract. A frequency fed for years does not stay confined to mood. It shows up as a jaw that aches by evening from clenching nobody remembers starting, as sleep that never quite reaches its deeper stages because some part of the nervous system stayed on watch all night, as a tiredness in the morning that 8 hours of sleep does not touch, because the exhaustion was never about hours in the first place. A woman in her 40s finally gets tested for the chronic headaches that have shadowed her for a decade, and the tests come back clean again, because there was never going to be a lesion to find. The cost was real. It was simply denominated in a currency her doctor had no instrument to measure. There is a difference worth drawing between a cost and a sacrifice, because collapsing the two lets people mistake one for the other and feel falsely at peace about it. A sacrifice is a cost you saw clearly and accepted in exchange for something specific you wanted more. A year of exhaustion traded deliberately for a business you believed in. A difficult conversation postponed on purpose because the timing genuinely mattered. A sacrifice, however hard, comes with a receipt you wrote yourself. What this chapter describes is rarely a sacrifice. It is a cost paid without a receipt, without ever having agreed to the exchange rate, extracted quietly while your attention was pointed somewhere else entirely. Consider the specific shape this takes in a relationship that has quietly narrowed over years. A couple stops having the difficult conversation, not because they resolved it, but because each avoidance was individually reasonable. A bad week, a tired evening, a fight not worth having tonight. 5 years pass this way, one reasonable postponement at a time, and what they lose is not a single dramatic fight. What they lose is the version of the relationship that would have existed if the conversation had happened in year 1 instead of year 6. A version neither of them can point to directly because it never got the chance to exist, which is exactly why grieving it is so strange and so easy to skip. Here is a distinction that matters enormously and gets blurred constantly. There is a difference between a cost you chose and a cost you never noticed you were paying. A chosen cost, even a painful one, tends to sit differently in a person. You can grieve it, resent it, even regret it. But there is a strange dignity in having known the price and paid it anyway for something you wanted more. An unnoticed cost carries none of that dignity. It carries only a quiet, low-grade sense of having been robbed by no one in particular, which is somehow harder to make peace with than being robbed by someone you could actually be angry at. This is worth sitting with honestly for a moment, without rushing past the discomfort. Think of one area of your life, work, a friendship, your health, where you would say, if asked directly, that things have been roughly the same for several years now. Not worse necessarily, just static. Ask yourself what a version of that area would look like if you had spent the last 3 years' worth of attention differently, feeding a different frequency, funding a different account. You are not required to answer this fully right now. Simply let the shape of the question sit somewhere you cannot immediately dismiss it. There is a particular kind of person who avoids ever doing this math, and it is worth naming why. Because the reason is more sympathetic than it first appears. Calculating the cost honestly requires admitting that some of it is genuinely gone, unrecoverable, the way 11 weeks spent on dread cannot be unspent no matter what you do starting tomorrow. People avoid the math not because they are careless, but because grief over unrecoverable time is a real and specific pain. And most people were never taught how to hold that particular grief without it collapsing into either denial or despair. There is a third option, quieter than both, which is simply acknowledging the cost accurately, feeling the weight of it honestly, and then asking what the next decade's ledger is going to look like, instead of only mourning the last one. That question, asked plainly, without performance, is the actual turning point this chapter has been building toward. Not because asking it fixes anything by itself, it does not. But a ledger you have never opened cannot be corrected. And a ledger you have finally opened, even with real losses visible on the page, is the first ledger you have ever had a real chance of closing differently. Chapter 6. 2 Different Skills. You have tried before. This is worth saying plainly before anything else in this chapter, because most books like this one skip straight past it, as if you are starting from nothing, as if no one ever handed you an app, a journal, a therapist's worksheet, a New Year's resolution, written with real intention. You have tried, several times probably, and the pattern is still here, which means the problem was never that you didn't try hard enough. This distinction matters more than almost any other in this entire journey, so it is worth stating without hedging. Trying harder and trying differently are not the same category of action, even though they get treated as synonyms constantly. Trying harder means doing the same thing with more force, more willpower, more self-discipline applied to an approach whose actual mechanism was never examined. Trying differently means asking what, specifically, about the previous approach was addressing the wrong layer of the problem, and building something new at the layer that actually needed it. Think about the last serious attempt you made to change something in yourself, a habit, a reaction, a pattern with someone you love. Picture the actual method you used. Chances are it involved some version of noticing the unwanted behavior after it happened and resolving sincerely to do better next time. This is the most common approach almost everyone tries first, and it fails for a specific structural reason worth naming clearly. It intervenes after the frequency has already been fully triggered and has already taken the wheel. By the time you notice you have raised your voice, or sent the text, or said yes to the thing you didn't want to do, the vibration was already running at full amplitude. Resolving to do better next time is asking your after-the-fact awareness to overpower a process that, by definition, only becomes visible once it has already won. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of timing, and timing is a fixable problem in a way that character is not, which is exactly why this distinction should feel like relief, rather than another indictment. You were not weak for failing at willpower after the fact. You were using a tool aimed at the wrong moment in the sequence, the way trying to steer a car by grabbing the wheel after it has already left the road will always fail regardless of how strong your grip is. Consider a second common approach, subtler than the first, which is trying to think your way out of a feeling. Something painful arrives, and the instinct is to reason with it, to build an argument sturdy enough to talk the feeling down. This works briefly, for exactly as long as the argument holds attention, and then the feeling returns, often stronger, because reasoning operates in language, and the vibration was never running in language to begin with. You cannot out-argue a frequency any more than you can out-argue a headache. Both require a different kind of intervention than the mind's favorite tool, which is more thinking. There is a third failed approach worth naming because it is the one people feel most ashamed of, and shame is exactly what keeps them from examining it honestly. This is the approach of simply removing yourself from anything that might trigger the pattern, avoiding the conversation, the person, the situation entirely. It looks like control from the outside. It even produces short-term relief, but it never touches the actual mechanism, because the frequency does not live in the trigger. It lives in you, portable, waiting in whatever new room you walk into next, wearing a different trigger's clothes. Picture a man who spent 2 years in therapy specifically to stop losing his temper with his teenage son. He learned the theory well. He could explain, in detail, where the anger came from, his own father's temper, the specific comment that always triggered it, the exact shape of the pattern. He could recite all of this calmly in a therapist's office on a Tuesday afternoon. And still, 3 weeks later, his son left a dish in the sink for the 4th time that week. And the same voice came out of him that he swore sincerely, in that same office, he would never use again. He was not lying when he made that promise. He simply made it from a calm room, aimed at a version of the trigger that had none of its actual heat, and then expected that promise to hold once the real heat arrived. Understanding a pattern in a cold state and interrupting it in a hot one are two different skills entirely, and almost nobody tells you that the first does not automatically produce the second. There is a distinction worth drawing here between insight and intervention, because people routinely mistake having the first for having done the second. Insight is knowing why the pattern exists, tracing it back to its origin, being able to explain it fluently to a friend over dinner. Intervention is the specific, practiced capacity to do something different in the 6 seconds the pattern is actually firing. A person can accumulate a decade of insight and still lose to the pattern every single time, because insight lives in the same calm, reflective state the pattern is never running in when it actually strikes. This is not a contradiction. It is simply two different pieces of equipment, and most previous attempts at change only ever built one of them. Here is what all three failed approaches share once you line them up next to each other. Each one tries to manage the pattern from a position downstream of where it actually starts, after the reaction, in an argument built to overpower the feeling, by avoiding the room instead of the frequency. None of them are stupid attempts. They are the natural attempts anyone would make without ever having been shown where the actual lever sits. The lever, as it turns out, sits earlier than all three of these attempts, in that half-second gap this book has already pointed toward once, the gap between a thought arriving and a command being issued. Every previous attempt intervened after that gap had already closed. What has never been tried, because it was never named as an option, is intervening inside the gap itself, before the amplification, before the argument, before the decision to leave the room. This does not mean the previous attempts were wasted. Each one taught you something true, even if it felt like failure at the time. The willpower attempt taught you exactly how fast the frequency moves once triggered. The reasoning attempt taught you that language alone cannot reach a vibration running underneath it. The avoidance attempt taught you that the pattern travels with you, which is, in its own way, the most useful failure of the three, because it proves definitively that the problem was never actually the room. You are not starting over, and you were never actually failing. You are finally aiming at the right layer, with the information your previous attempts, however discouraging they felt at the time, were quietly gathering for you the entire time, patiently, without your knowledge until now. Chapter 7. The Millimeter. There is a specific 2-second window worth learning to recognize, and once you can recognize it,
Everything before this chapter starts to look like preparation for this exact moment. It happens right after a trigger and right before the frequency is finished amplifying, the gap between the sting arriving and the sting becoming a spiral. Most people never learn to see this window, not because it is small, though it is, but because nobody ever pointed a finger at it and said, "Here, this is the place. This is where your hand actually reaches the mechanism." Here is the idea worth sitting with before anything practical gets said. You have spent this entire journey assuming the goal is to eliminate certain feelings, to get rid of the dread, the anger, the tightening before the threshold. That was never actually the target, and aiming at it explains a great deal of why previous attempts failed. Anger and calm are not two separate feelings living in different rooms. They are 2 points on a single continuous line, the same current running at a different intensity and direction. You do not need to destroy anger to reach calm. You need to move your position along the line you were already standing on. This changes the entire task from something enormous and unlikely, becoming a person who never feels the trigger, into something small and immediately available, shifting your position on a line you are already occupying every single day. Think of a dimmer switch instead of an on-off light. You have been treating your reactions like a light that is either fully on or fully off, believing the only options are full eruption or full suppression. A dimmer switch has an entire range between those 2 points, and the range is where the actual skill lives. Here is the fragment, stated as plainly as it can be stated. The first real movement that works today, not after months of practice, not after some larger transformation. The instant you notice the sting, the tightening, the first half second of a familiar frequency rising, you name it silently in 3 or 4 words, without judgment and without a story attached. Not, "He is always like this." Not, "This always happens to me." Just the bare fact. Anger rising, fear rising, dread rising. That is the entire technique in its smallest form. And it works precisely because naming a rising state moves you instantly from being the frequency to observing the frequency. And those are 2 entirely different positions on the same line. Consider why this small act does something that willpower alone never managed. Naming requires a part of you that is not currently on fire to do the naming. The moment that part activates, even for a second, you are no longer fully identified with the rising frequency. You have created, however briefly, the exact gap that every previous attempt was trying and failing to force open from the outside. This gap was not available to force. It was available to notice. And noticing turns out to be a door that opens from a completely different side than the one everyone keeps pushing on. Think of a woman who tried this for the first time on an ordinary Wednesday, in a meeting where a colleague took credit for an idea that was clearly hers. The old pattern would have had her sitting through the rest of the meeting composing the email she would send that afternoon, the one that would finally make her position understood, rehearsing lines she would probably never actually send. Instead, she noticed the heat rise in her face and said to herself, silently, under the fluorescent lights, "Anger rising." Nothing about the room changed. Her colleague kept talking. But she noticed for the first time in years that she was choosing to keep listening rather than being dragged out of the room by her own reaction, and that choosing, small as it looked from the outside, felt entirely different from the inside than every other version of this exact meeting she had sat through before. There is a long-term consequence worth naming here, because the first few times this technique is used, it can feel almost too small to matter. And it is worth knowing in advance what accumulates underneath that smallness. Every single time you name a rising frequency instead of being swept by it, you are not just handling one irritation. You are demonstrating to the part of you that runs on habit that a different response is available and survivable. Habits are not changed by one dramatic decision. They are changed by hundreds of small demonstrations, each one slightly loosening the grip of the old groove, until one day the new response is simply the one that fires first, without you needing to remember to reach for it. Try this the next time a small irritation arrives, something minor enough that the stakes are low, a delayed train, a slow reply to a message that shouldn't matter this much. The moment you feel the familiar tightening, say to yourself, quietly, irritation, rising. Notice what happens in the half-second after you name it. For most people, something small and almost disappointing happens. Nothing dramatic, no sudden peace, just a fraction of a degree of distance, a millimeter of space between you and the feeling that was not there a second before. That millimeter is not nothing. It is the entire mechanism in its most basic, most reliable form. This does not mean the feeling disappears. That was never the goal. And expecting it to disappear is exactly the mistake that made previous attempts collapse. The feeling is still there, still real, still worth attending to. What changes is your position relative to it, from inside the current being carried wherever it goes, to beside the current, watching where it is trying to take you, with enough space to choose whether to go. Here is a distinction worth holding carefully, because it is easy to get backwards. Naming a feeling is not the same as suppressing it, even though both can look, from the outside, like a kind of calm. Suppression says, "I am not angry," while the jaw stays clenched and the frequency runs unaddressed underneath the denial. Naming says, "Anger rising," while letting the sensation be fully present, fully felt, simply observed rather than obeyed. One hides the vibration. The other meets it directly, without adding fuel. The difference sounds subtle in words. It is not subtle in the body. One leaves you exhausted by evening. The other leaves you, strangely, a little more rested than you expected to be. You will not do this perfectly the first 10 times you try. Some irritations will still take the wheel completely before you remember there was ever a window to notice. This is not failure. It is calibration. The same way anyone learning to catch a ball misses more often at the start than after months of practice. What matters right now is not mastery. What matters is that you now know the window exists, that it has a specific size and a specific location, right after the trigger and right before the spiral, and that your hand, for the first time, actually knows where to reach. Chapter 8. The Old Employee. You will try the millimeter for a week, maybe 2, and something in you will start to resist it quietly, without announcing itself as resistance. It will not feel like sabotage. It will feel like forgetting. You will simply, on a Thursday, fail to notice the rising frequency in time. And by Friday, you will have stopped trying altogether, telling yourself you got busy. Which is true, and also not the actual reason. Here is the part worth naming plainly, because almost nobody explains it, and its absence makes people think they are uniquely bad at change. Any part of you that has run on autopilot for years does not experience your new awareness as help. It experiences it as a threat. Not because the old pattern wants to hurt you. Because the old pattern has a job. One it has performed reliably for a long time, and the job has value, even if the value is outdated. The resistance you feel is not an enemy. It is closer to an old employee who has just watched you install new equipment and correctly suspects that their position is about to change. Think about what the old pattern was actually doing for you. Underneath the cost it also carried. The dread on Sunday night kept you from being blindsided by Monday. The tightening before the threshold kept you scanning for danger in rooms that once, a long time ago, actually contained danger. The armor was built for a reason, at a time when it was needed, by a version of you who did not have the option this book is offering. Resistance is not proof that the new approach is wrong. It is proof the old approach worked well enough once to be worth defending. This distinction changes how you should expect resistance to show up, because it rarely shows up as a direct refusal. It shows up as forgetting, as sudden busyness, as a wave of tiredness precisely when you meant to practice, as a small voice that says, quite reasonably, "You don't need to do this today. You'll do it tomorrow when things are calmer." Notice that things are never calmer.
That sentence is not a plan. It is the resistance's favorite disguise, because it sounds like patience instead of what it actually is. Consider a specific and common version of this. A man decides, after years of losing his temper with his son, that he will finally practice naming the rising heat instead of letting it fire. The first week goes reasonably well. The second week, his son does something that would have triggered him even more than usual. And in that exact moment, the moment the technique mattered most, he finds himself unable to remember it at all, as though the entire skill evaporated. Later that night, replaying it, he notices something else worth naming. It was not that he forgot in general. He forgot specifically in the one scenario that mattered most to him, which is never a coincidence, because resistance does not distribute itself evenly across every trigger. It concentrates exactly where the stakes, and the old wound underneath them, run deepest. This is not evidence the technique failed. It is evidence of a specific and predictable law. Resistance is always strongest exactly where the old pattern is most entrenched, which means the moments where the new skill collapses first are not random failures. They are a map, showing you precisely where the oldest, thickest part of the pattern lives. Here is a distinction worth holding carefully, because confusing the two leads people to abandon good technique for no reason. There is a difference between resistance and evidence the approach is wrong. Resistance feels like friction, like forgetting, like a pull backward toward the familiar groove. Evidence the approach is wrong feels different, more like a clean, specific misalignment. The sense that even when you do remember to try it, it produces nothing useful at all. Most people who quit a genuine practice quit during resistance, mistaking friction for failure, when friction is actually a sign that the practice has found exactly the spot that needed it most. There is a version of resistance that dresses itself up as reasonableness, and it deserves its own attention because it is the hardest to catch. It sounds less like forgetting and more like a calm internal argument, something along the lines of, "This technique is fine for small irritations, but this particular situation is different. This person really is impossible. This circumstance really does justify the old response." Notice how convincing this argument can feel in the moment. And notice, too, that the old pattern always found the current situation to be the exception. That is precisely how a pattern survives for years without ever being examined. It does not defend itself in general terms. It defends itself one specific, seemingly justified exception at a time. And each exception, granted individually, feels entirely reasonable, while quietly rebuilding the exact groove you were trying to leave. Ask yourself honestly, the next time this argument shows up, whether the situation in front of you is actually different in kind from every other situation the old pattern has ever claimed as an exception, or whether it simply feels different because it is close, because closeness always feels more urgent and more justified than distance. Most exceptions, examined honestly after the fact, look remarkably similar to every other exception that came before them. The pattern is not creatively finding new justifications. It is running the same justification it has always run, dressed in whatever costume the current moment happens to be wearing. There is a reason this friction concentrates so precisely around your oldest and most protected patterns, and it is worth sitting with honestly. The patterns that generate the strongest resistance are almost always the ones that once did real protective work, sometimes decades ago, in circumstances you may not fully remember. A child who learned to go quiet during conflict because quiet kept them safe grows into an adult whose resistance to speaking up in conflict is not weakness. It is loyalty, misapplied to a present that no longer requires the same protection, but loyalty nonetheless. And loyalty does not release its grip simply because you have decided intellectually that the danger has passed. This reframes what you are actually doing when resistance appears. And the reframe matters. You are not fighting yourself. You are negotiating with an old employee who kept you safe under different conditions, and has not yet been told, clearly and repeatedly, that conditions have changed. Negotiation takes longer than a single conversation. It takes the same thing every real negotiation takes: consistency, patience, and enough repeated evidence that the new approach is not going to leave you exposed the way the old fear once predicted it would. The next time you notice yourself forgetting the millimeter exactly when you needed it most, resist the urge to read that forgetting as proof you are bad at this.
Read it instead as a location marker. You have just found one of the oldest rooms in the structure, the one guarded the most fiercely, which means you have just found, without meaning to, exactly where the real work is going to happen next, and knowing that in advance is worth more than any single successful attempt at the practice itself. Chapter 9. The Tide Going Out. You will have a good week. Then, without any single obvious cause, you will have a bad one. And on the third day of the bad week, exhausted, underslept, running on nothing, the millimeter will simply not be there when you reach for it. You will raise your voice at someone who did not deserve it, or send the text you knew you shouldn't. And the thought that follows will be almost certainly some version of, "I thought I was past this." Here is what nobody tells you about progress, and it is worth knowing in advance instead of discovering it the hard way. Progress does not move in a straight line, ever, for anyone, in any domain. It moves the way a tide moves, forward and back, with the net direction only visible if you are willing to measure across weeks instead of days. A single bad evening feels like proof the entire effort failed. It is almost never that. It is simply the back half of a rhythm whose forward half you were, until that moment, mistaking for permanent. This matters enormously because the specific moment progress collapses is almost never a moment of high energy. It is almost always a moment of depletion, when you are tired, hungry, underslept, or already stretched thin by something unrelated. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a personal failing either. The millimeter, the pause between trigger and reaction, requires a small amount of genuine mental resource to execute. When that resource is already spent elsewhere, on a sleepless night, a stressful week at work, a body fighting off the beginning of an illness, there is simply less of it available for the pause, and the old groove, needing no resource at all because it runs on autopilot, wins by default. Picture a woman 3 months into practicing the millimeter, genuinely transformed in how she handles conflict with her sister, calm in conversations that used to end in tears within minutes. Her father is hospitalized unexpectedly. For 2 weeks she barely sleeps, shuttling between work and the hospital, and in the middle of that stretch, her sister says something small and thoughtless, and the old explosive response comes roaring back exactly as it used to, as though 3 months of practice had simply never happened. She spends the drive home convinced she has lost everything she built. What actually happened is far less catastrophic and far more mechanical. She had been running on almost no resource for 2 weeks, and the pause she had built required resource she genuinely did not have available in that specific moment. The skill was not gone. It was, for those 2 weeks, unaffordable, the way a person with an empty wallet cannot buy something they could easily afford on a normal week, regardless of how many times they have bought it before. There is a difference worth naming between a lapse and a relapse, because the two get treated as the same thing constantly, and treating them the same is what turns a single bad evening into a genuine collapse. A lapse is one instance of the old pattern firing, isolated, explainable by conditions, over as soon as it happens. A relapse is a lapse that gets reinterpreted as proof the entire effort was fraudulent, which then produces a second lapse, then a third, not because the skill degraded, but because the story told about the first lapse gave permission for the ones that followed. The tide going out for a day is not the same as deciding the tide has stopped existing, and there is no longer any reason to watch for it coming back in. Think about the last time this happened to you specifically. It is worth being honest about the conditions rather than the content. It was probably not a moment when the trigger was unusually severe. It was probably a moment when you were unusually depleted. And an ordinary trigger, one you have handled cleanly a dozen times before, suddenly had nothing standing between it and your full reaction. The pattern did not get stronger that day. Your resource simply ran out before it could stand guard. Here is a distinction worth holding carefully, because it changes how harshly you judge yourself in these moments. There is a difference between regression and depletion. Regression would mean the skill itself has been lost, that the millimeter no longer works, that the entire structure you have been building has come undone. Depletion means the skill is intact, but the resource required to access it in that particular moment was insufficient. The same way a muscle that can lift 40 pounds on a rested day might fail at 30 on a day it was already exhausted before you asked anything of it. The muscle did not get weaker. The conditions changed. Almost everyone treats a depleted evening as regression, and that misreading alone does more damage to long-term progress than the original bad evening ever did, because it is the misreading, not the evening, that makes people quit entirely. Consider what it would mean to plan for this rhythm in advance instead of being ambushed by it every time. Anyone building real strength in any domain learns to expect a bad week roughly proportional to how demanding the good weeks were, and builds a plan for exactly that week rather than assuming it will simply not arrive. This is not resignation. It is closer to the difference between a sailor who expects rough water on a long crossing and one who is shocked by every wave, as though the ocean had personally betrayed them for behaving like an ocean. There is a specific practice worth adopting for these depleted moments, simpler than anything asked of you so far, because depletion is exactly the wrong time to ask for more effort. When you notice you are running low, tired, stretched, already spent, lower the bar deliberately, instead of holding it at full height and failing against it. The full technique asks you to name the rising frequency and hold space beside it. On a depleted day, the smaller, still meaningful version is simply this. Notice, after the fact, without judgment, that the old pattern fired. Not in the moment. Afterward. 20 minutes later, an hour later, whenever the resource returns enough to look back honestly. This after-the-fact noticing does not prevent the reaction. It does something almost as valuable. It keeps the thread of awareness alive through the bad week, instead of letting the week convince you the thread was cut entirely. This is the actual skill hiding inside this chapter, more valuable than any single successful pause. It is the capacity to keep showing up for the practice, in whatever diminished form the depleted day allows, without demanding of yourself the same performance the rested day made possible. A rhythm that includes low points is not evidence of failure. It is evidence you are dealing with something real, something alive, something that behaves the way every living process behaves, in waves rather than lines. The tide will come back in. It always does. Your job, on the low days, is simply not to convince yourself the ocean has permanently receded. Chapter 10. 2 hands on the same rope. You can practice the millimeter alone in a parked car, in a shower, in the quiet 10 minutes before anyone else wakes up, and it will feel almost effortless there. Nobody in a parked car interrupts you halfway through naming the rising heat. Nobody in a shower needs you to be somewhere in the next 4 minutes. The real test was never going to happen in those rooms, and you likely already sense this, even before this chapter says it plainly. The real test happens across a table from someone whose own frequency is rising at the exact same moment yours is, each of you feeding the other's fire without either one intending to. Here is what changes the instant a second person enters the equation, and it is worth being precise about it instead of vague. Alone, your rising frequency has only your own attention to be fed by. With another person present, it has 2 sources, your attention and theirs, arriving in a loop that moves faster than either of you can consciously track. You raise your voice slightly. Their face tightens in response. That tightening lands in you as confirmation the conversation is going badly, which raises your voice further, which tightens their face further.
Neither of you started this loop deliberately. Both of you are, at every single point along it, simultaneously cause and effect, feeding a fire neither of you would have chosen if asked directly. This is worth naming clearly, because most people, in the middle of a rising argument, experience themselves as purely reacting to the other person, never as contributing a signal the other person is also reacting to. Ask yourself honestly, the next time you notice a familiar argument spiraling, whether your own rising volume, your own crossed arms, your own clipped tone arrived before or after the other person's shift toward defensiveness. Most people, examined honestly, discover the sequence is far more tangled than either instigator or victim. It is a genuine loop, running both directions at once, and the question of who started it is usually far less useful than the question of who is willing to be the first to change the frequency they are contributing to it right now. Consider what it actually means to be the first to change a shared frequency, because this is not the same as simply staying calm while the other person rages, a version of the idea that sounds noble and usually backfires. Forced calm in the middle of someone else's genuine distress often reads, correctly, as distance, as a wall rather than a hand, and it can escalate the very fire it was meant to cool. What actually shifts a shared frequency is not performing calm. It is doing the millimeter honestly, silently naming your own rising heat to yourself, without pretending it isn't there, and then choosing your next word from that slightly wider space instead of from the reflex. The other person cannot see the internal naming. What they can feel, almost immediately, is the different quality of what comes out of you next. Think about a specific argument you have had more than once with the same person, the one that seems to follow an identical script every time, starting from a different trigger but ending in the same 3 or 4 accusations, the same raised voices, the same slammed door or long silence. Notice that a script this consistent is not really about the content each time. Two people who have run the same argument 50 times are not actually debating 50 different subjects. They are running one shared frequency, worn into a groove by repetition, and the specific words are almost interchangeable, chosen more for their familiarity than their accuracy. Picture two roommates who have had a version of the same fight about shared chores for 2 years, always starting from a slightly different trigger, a dish, a bill, a forgotten errand, and always ending in the same accusation about respect and the same defensive silence that follows. One of them decides, after reading something like this, to try changing only her half of the loop. The next time the trigger appears, a stack of unwashed dishes she has walked past 4 times that week, she notices the familiar heat rising, names it silently, and instead of opening with the usual accusation, she says only what is true and specific, that she is tired and would like help tonight. Her roommate, expecting the usual script, is visibly thrown by the absence of the accusation, and the conversation, for the first time in 2 years, does not escalate into the same 3 accusations it always has. Nothing about the roommate changed that evening. Only one side of the loop did, and that alone was enough to produce an entirely different shape. Here is a distinction worth holding on to, because it changes what you are actually responsible for in a shared spiral. You are never responsible for the other person's rising frequency. You cannot control what they feed with their attention, what old wound their nervous system is defending, what resource they walked in already depleted of before the conversation even started. What you are responsible for, and the only thing you were ever actually responsible for, is your own contribution to the loop. The 50% of the feedback cycle that has always technically been in your hands, even on the days it did not feel that way. This is not a small thing, even though it can feel disappointingly modest compared to the fantasy of simply fixing the other person. A loop requires 2 active contributors to sustain itself. Change your 50% consistently enough, and the loop, structurally, cannot run the same way it always has, whether or not the other person ever reads a page of this material. This does not guarantee the other person changes. It guarantees the shape of the exchange changes, because the exact fuel that used to be available to it is no longer arriving from your side in the same quantity. There is a longer-term pattern worth naming here, one that only becomes visible across months rather than single conversations. The people around you have learned over years roughly what to expect from your frequency in a given kind of moment, and they have built their own responses around that expectation, often without either of you ever discussing it directly. When your contribution genuinely shifts, and shifts consistently rather than as an isolated exception, the people closest to you will eventually recalibrate what they expect and what they bring, because relationships are not static agreements. They are living loops, responsive to whatever each side keeps actually contributing month after month, whether either person ever names the mechanism out loud. This recalibration rarely happens quickly, and it rarely happens because you announce the change. It happens the same way trust rebuilds after any long pattern, quietly, through repetition, until the other person's nervous system, not just their conscious mind, believes the new frequency is the one actually available now, and stops bracing, by old reflex, for the exact old frequency that used to greet them at this same table year after year, before anything actually changed. Chapter 11. The Original Room. There was a first time. Long before the roommate, long before the sister, long before any of the rooms this journey has walked through so far, there was an original room where this exact frequency first learned how to run. You may not remember it clearly, most people don't. But the body remembers something even language forgot, and that is worth taking seriously instead of dismissing as sentimentality. Consider how a pattern like this actually gets built, because the mechanism is simpler and less mysterious than it is usually made to sound. A child in a specific repeated situation, a house where raised voices meant real danger, a parent whose attention arrived only when something went visibly wrong, a household where needs stated plainly were met with irritation rather than care, learns, the way any young organism learns, through repetition rather than reasoning. Nobody sat that child down and explained the strategy. The strategy assembled itself, silently, out of 100 small repeated confirmations, until it became something faster than thought, something the body simply does now, without consultation, the instant a similar shape appears in an adult room decades later. This is worth naming plainly, because it changes the tone of everything that follows in this chapter. The pattern was never a flaw in your design. It was a solution, built by a younger, less resourced version of you, to a real problem that version faced with the only materials available at the time. A child who learns to go quiet during conflict is not developing a character weakness. That child is developing the single most effective strategy available to someone with no power to leave the room, no authority to change the adult's behavior, and no other tool on hand besides silence and stillness. The strategy worked. That is precisely why it is still here. Here is a distinction worth holding very carefully, because collapsing it produces either excessive blame of the people who raised you, or excessive blame of yourself, and neither is accurate or useful. There is a difference between origin and fault. Origin simply describes where a pattern was built and under what conditions. Fault assigns moral responsibility for its existence. You can trace a pattern to its origin with complete clarity. A specific house, a specific dynamic, a specific repeated moment, without needing to conclude that anyone involved was a villain or that you were ever broken for adapting the way you did. Almost every parent who contributed to a pattern like this was themselves running an inherited frequency, built in their own original room, decades before you arrived to inherit the next version of it. Think about what this actually looked like in practice, in a form specific enough to be useful, rather than abstract enough to slide past unnoticed. A woman who cannot tolerate silence in an argument, who needs resolution immediately, who feels a genuine wave of panic if a conversation is left unfinished overnight, can often trace this directly to a childhood where a parent's silence was not neutral. It was the opening act of something frightening, a punishment delivered through withdrawal rather than words, As a child, immediate resolution was not a preference. It was survival, the fastest available route back to safety. As an adult, in a relationship with a partner who simply needs an evening to think before responding, that same urgency fires at full strength, mistaking an ordinary pause for the same danger it once actually was. Consider a second version of this, because the mechanism does not only produce dramatic patterns from dramatic households. A man who cannot receive a compliment without immediately deflecting it, who turns every piece of praise into a joke or a correction before it can fully land, often traces this to a much quieter origin. A household where being noticed too much invited comparison to an older sibling, or where pride, expressed openly, was met with a sharp reminder not to get above yourself. Nothing violent happened in that house, nothing anyone would call abuse. And yet a small, consistent lesson was absorbed just as effectively as any dramatic one. Visibility is dangerous, so deflect it before anyone else has the chance to. Decades later, a genuine compliment from a colleague lands in an adult body, still running that original arithmetic, still calculating in a fraction of a second that the safest response is to make the praise disappear as quickly as possible. There is a long-term cost to never locating a root like this, and it is worth naming plainly rather than leaving it implied. A pattern whose origin remains unexamined does not simply repeat itself in your own life. It very often gets passed forward, the same way it was passed to you, not through any deliberate teaching, but through the same quiet repetition that built it in the first place. The man who deflects every compliment will likely, without ever intending to, teach his own children the same reflex, simply by modeling it in front of them for years, long before either party consciously decides anything about how praise should be handled in that house. Locating the root is not only about your own relief. It is often the exact point where a pattern stops being handed forward by default. Notice that nothing about this origin requires you to excuse or condemn anyone from that original room in order to understand it. The point of tracing the root is not to build a case, for a courtroom that does not exist, about who is to blame. The point is mechanical. A pattern built to solve a problem that no longer exists in the same form will keep firing exactly as it was built to fire until something updates its information about the present. You cannot update information you have never located, and the location is always, without exception, further back than the adult trigger currently getting blamed for it. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly, not to produce an immediate answer, but to let the question do its slow work over the coming days. When you notice the pattern firing hardest, in the specific relationship or situation where it costs you the most, ask what that pattern would have been protecting, specifically, in a much younger version of you, faced with much less power than you have now. Do not rush toward an answer that sounds impressive or therapeutic. Let the actual specific answer surface at its own pace, because a true root, once found honestly, tends to arrive quietly rather than dramatically, often smaller and more ordinary than the size of the adult reaction it still produces. You are not that child anymore. This sentence sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet very few people have actually let it land all the way down into the body, rather than just accepting it as a fact at the level of language. You have resources now that child never had, options, exits, a voice that people actually listen to, the ability to leave rooms that once had no door. The pattern does not know this yet, because patterns update slowly and only through repeated, lived evidence, not through a single sentence read once in a book. But the knowing has to start somewhere, and it starts here, in the plain, unglamorous act of finally locating the room the pattern was actually built in. Rather than continuing to blame the room it merely keeps mistaking for that one. Chapter 12. The Young Plant. 6 months from now, if nothing structural changes, you will likely be roughly where you started. Not because the millimeter stopped working, not because the root you found in the last chapter stopped being true. Because progress that depends entirely on remembering
on willpower reasserting itself every single day without support, decays at a predictable rate the same way anything unmaintained does. And almost nobody warns you about this decay in advance, which is exactly why it feels like personal failure when it arrives instead of the ordinary physics it actually is. Think about the last genuinely good stretch you had with any change you attempted, not just this one. A period of eating well, of exercising consistently, of speaking more gently with someone you love. Notice how it usually ended. Rarely with a single dramatic event that undid it. Almost always with a quiet erosion, one skipped day that felt harmless, followed by another, until the gap between good days grew wide enough that the whole structure simply stopped being a practice and became, again, a memory of a practice. This is not a flaw specific to you. It is what happens to any effort that relies purely on remembering under conditions, a busy week, a bad mood, a change in routine, that were never actually accounted for in the plan. Here is the distinction worth understanding clearly, because it changes what actually needs to be built next. There is a difference between motivation and structure. Motivation is a feeling, genuinely useful at the start of any change, entirely unreliable as a foundation for the middle or the end of one. Structure is something external to the feeling entirely, a specific time, a specific trigger, a specific small commitment that does not require you to feel motivated in order to execute it. Motivation got you to open this book. Motivation will not be present, reliably, 6 months from now, on a random Tuesday when nothing in particular is going right. Structure does not care whether you feel like it. That is precisely what makes it durable, in a way feeling never is. Picture a man who spent 3 focused weeks practicing the millimeter with real success, handling conflict at work with a steadiness that surprised even him. Then his company entered a stressful merger, 12-hour days for a month, and the practice, which had never been attached to anything except his own daily intention to remember it, simply stopped happening, not through any decision, but through the same quiet erosion this chapter describes. 3 months later, in a calmer season, he noticed he had drifted entirely back to his old reactive patterns and felt a fresh wave of shame at having lost something he had worked hard for. What he had actually lost was not the skill itself, which remained perfectly available to him. What he had lost was the only mechanism connecting the skill to his actual days, an unstructured intention that could not survive contact with a genuinely demanding season. The exact season any real structure needs to be built to survive. Consider what a piece of real structure actually looks like, because the word can sound abstract until it is made concrete. It is not a vague intention to be more mindful. It is a specific trigger paired with a specific small action, tied to something that already happens reliably in your day regardless of mood. Every time you put your key in the front door after work, before you say a single word to anyone inside, you take one breath and silently check what frequency you are currently carrying into the house. That is structure. It does not ask you to remember out of nowhere. It attaches itself to an action you were already going to take anyway, whether you were motivated that day or not. There is a reason this kind of attachment matters more than sheer intention, and it is worth explaining plainly rather than leaving it as an assertion. The mind that forgets to practice at random moments during an unstructured day rarely forgets to open the front door. Attaching a new behavior to an old automatic one borrows the old behavior's reliability, the same way a smaller boat lashed securely to a larger one gets pulled along a route it could never have navigated alone in rough water. The goal is never to rely on your future self having more discipline than your present self currently has. The goal is to design something that works even on the exact day your future self has none to spare. There is a related distinction worth naming before moving on, because it prevents a common overcorrection. Structure is not the same as rigidity. A rigid plan demands the exact same performance every single day, regardless of circumstance, and breaks entirely the first time life refuses to cooperate with it. Real structure bends without breaking,
because it asks for something small enough to survive a bad day intact. The man from the merger did not need a plan that demanded 30 minutes of reflection every evening during a 12-hour workday. He needed one breath at one door, small enough that even his most depleted self could still manage it, which is precisely the kind of structure this chapter is describing. Think about protecting progress the way you would protect a young plant, rather than the way you would protect a finished wall. A wall, once built, mostly maintains itself. A young plant needs staking, needs water on a schedule, needs protection from a single hard frost that could undo months of growth in one night. The early months of any real change are closer to the plant than the wall, and treating them as though they are already the wall, assuming the new pattern can simply stand there unsupported, the way an old, deeply grooved pattern always could, is one of the most common and least discussed reasons genuine progress quietly disappears. Here is a specific commitment worth making before this chapter ends, small enough to actually keep, structural enough to survive a bad week, more useful than any ambitious plan you might otherwise be tempted to draft tonight. Choose one moment that already happens reliably every day, a specific door, a specific drive, a specific meal, and attach to it one small, honest check of your current frequency. Nothing more elaborate than that. Do not choose 10 moments. Choose one. A structure with one point of attachment, kept faithfully for a month, will outperform an ambitious plan with 10 points of attachment abandoned by the second week, every single time. Because durability was never a function of ambition. It was always a function of how little the structure asked of a version of you that was already running low. The wall you are building here is not made of intensity. It is made of repetition, small and unglamorous, attached to a door you were always going to walk through anyway, whether or not anyone was watching, whether or not you felt, on that particular evening, like doing anything differently at all, which is exactly the kind of evening this structure was built to survive. Chapter 13. The Toll Booth That Closes. Somewhere around the third month of the small structure from the last chapter, something quiet starts to shift that has nothing to do with the structure itself. You stop thinking of the breath at the door as something you do. You start noticing it happen before you consciously decide to do it. The way you do not decide to check for oncoming traffic before crossing a street you have crossed 1,000 times. The action has migrated. It has stopped living in the category of things you remember to do and started living in the category of things you simply are. This migration is worth understanding precisely, because it is the actual mechanism by which any lasting change occurs, and almost nobody explains it in these terms. A habit, in its early form, requires a decision every single time it happens. You decide to take the breath at the door. You decide to name the rising frequency. Each repetition costs a small amount of conscious effort, a toll paid at every crossing. Identity is what happens when the toll booth quietly closes because the road has been driven so many times it no longer requires a decision to travel. You do not decide to be someone who locks the front door at night. You simply are, by now, someone who does, and the absence of decision is not carelessness. It is the actual finish line every practice in this book has been walking toward. Picture a woman 8 months into this practice, sitting at a dinner where an old friend says something that would once have wrecked her entire evening. An offhand comment about a decision she made years ago that still, technically, has the power to sting. She notices, almost with mild surprise, that she has already named the small flicker of heat and let it settle before her fork has even returned to the table. Nobody at the dinner saw anything happen. There was no visible pause, no deep breath anyone would have noticed, no moment where she appeared to be working at something. It simply passed through and out the other side, the way weather passes through a room with an open window, and she only recognizes, hours later, replaying the evening, that something which once would have occupied her entire drive home did not occupy so much as a single extra thought. She did not do the millimeter that night. She simply was, by then,
someone the millimeter had already become part of. Consider the profound difference this makes in how a person relates to setbacks, because it is one of the most practically important distinctions in this entire journey. Someone who is still doing a behavior, who has not yet arrived at being it, experiences a missed day as evidence the behavior was fragile, easily abandoned, perhaps never truly theirs to begin with.
Someone who has crossed into being experiences a missed day very differently, as a single unusual event that does not touch the underlying fact of who they are. The way a person who identifies deeply as someone who keeps their word does not question that identity after one broken promise made under extreme circumstance. They simply notice the exception and return to the pattern that actually describes them. This is why the earlier chapters spent so much time on repetition, on structure, on surviving depletion and resistance without abandoning the practice entirely. None of that effort was really about perfecting a technique. It was about accumulating enough repeated evidence that a new identity could form underneath the technique, because identity, unlike a single decision, does not form from one dramatic moment. It forms the same way sediment forms rock, through pressure applied consistently over a long enough time that what was once loose and separate becomes eventually a single solid thing. There is a related honest question worth asking here, because identity, once formed, can quietly slide towards its own kind of rigidity if it goes entirely unexamined. Becoming someone calmer does not mean becoming someone who never feels the old frequency again. It means the frequency no longer automatically dictates the action that follows it. A person who has genuinely become calmer under this definition still feels a flash of real anger sometimes. What has changed is not the presence of the feeling but its authority over what happens next, which is a much more honest and much more sustainable version of change than the fantasy of a person who has simply stopped feeling things that once bothered them. Here is a distinction worth holding carefully, because it prevents a very common and very costly mistake. There is a difference between performing a change and becoming it. Performance is visible immediately and requires ongoing effort to maintain in front of an audience, real or imagined. Becoming is invisible in the moment and requires no audience at all, because it has stopped being a performance and started being simply what happens, whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not there is any reward waiting on the other side of it. A person who is performing calm in front of a partner during an argument will often collapse the instant the partner leaves the room, because the performance had an audience requirement that being calm never actually had. A person who has become someone calmer stays roughly as calm alone in the car afterward as they were at the table, because there was never an audience to begin with. Think honestly about which category the practices from this book currently occupy for you right now. In this exact moment, not in some imagined future version of yourself. Are you still deciding each time to take the breath at the door, still requiring the specific memory of this book to prompt the millimeter in a rising conversation? Or has some of it, even a little, started to happen on its own, arriving before the decision rather than because of it? Neither answer is a failure. Performance is simply an earlier stage on the same road becoming eventually travels, and every single identity you currently hold without effort, the one that locks the door, the one that says please and thank you without thinking, started once as a performance you had to remember to keep up. There is a longer arc worth naming here, one that stretches beyond any single practice this book has offered, and worth carrying with you past the final page of this chapter. The specific technique matters far less in the end than the underlying shift it is quietly producing, from a person who is run by whatever frequency happens to arrive, toward a person who has some genuine say in which frequencies get to run the show. That shift, once it becomes identity rather than performance, does not require this book anymore. It does not require remembering a chapter number or a phrase learned from a stranger's careful sentences. It simply becomes the water you swim in, so ordinary from the inside that you may eventually forget it was ever any other way, which is, in its own quiet and unremarkable manner, the clearest possible sign that it actually worked. Chapter 14. The Whole Shape. Stand back for a moment from all of it. The mirror, the frequency, the millimeter, the old room, the young plant, and look at the whole shape at once. The way you might finally step back from a wall you have been laying brick by brick for months, close enough until now to see only the brick directly in front of you, never quite able to make out the wall it was slowly becoming. From this distance a single structure becomes visible, and it is worth naming plainly, because naming the whole shape is different from knowing each of its parts individually. Here is the shape. Your mind is not a mirror reflecting a neutral world back at you. It is a generator, running a current at all times, and that current, whatever its rate, tends to produce a matching world around it, not through magic but through attention, posture, and the 1,000 small choices a state makes without asking permission. That current is not fixed. It can be recognized in the half-second gap before it fully takes hold, named rather than obeyed, met rather than suppressed. That naming does not happen easily at first because an older frequency built long ago in a room that once required exactly the strategy it built resists being questioned, not out of malice, but out of loyalty to a danger that no longer exists in its original form. That resistance eases, not through force, but through repetition, structured onto something reliable enough to survive the days you have nothing left to give it. And repetition, held faithfully long enough, stops being something you do and becomes, quietly, something you are. This is not 5 separate lessons stacked on top of each other, memorized in order and recited back individually. It is one continuous motion, seen from 5 different angles. The same way a single wave can be described by its height, its speed, its direction, and its cause, without any of those descriptions being a different wave. You have spent this entire book learning to see one motion more clearly, not learning 5 unrelated tricks. Picture a woman who has now lived through everything this book describes across roughly a year, not perfectly, not in a straight line, but with enough real repetition to have crossed genuinely from performing into becoming. Her mother says something cutting at a family dinner, the exact kind of comment that used to cost her the rest of the evening and half of the next day. She notices the familiar heat, names it without drama, feels the old root stir somewhere underneath it, remembers faintly and without needing to rehearse it, that the pattern she is watching in her mother is also an old frequency, running from its own original room decades before either of them arrived at this table. None of this takes more than a second or two. She responds, not with suppressed anger and not with an explosion, but with a single clear sentence that would not have been available to her a year earlier. And the evening continues, imperfect, ordinary, genuinely hers. This is what the whole shape looks like in practice. Not 5 separate techniques deployed in sequence, but one fluent motion, indistinguishable from the outside, from simply being a calmer person. Consider what changes when you hold the whole shape at once, instead of any single piece of it. A person who only has the millimeter, without understanding the root beneath it, tends to apply the technique mechanically, wondering why it sometimes fails against certain triggers with a stubbornness the others do not share. Once the root is visible, the mechanical failure makes sense. Some frequencies are simply older, better defended, more thoroughly loyal to a danger that once was genuinely real, and they require more patient repeated evidence before they update, exactly the way any negotiation with a wary old employee takes longer than a single conversation. A person who only has the structure, without understanding identity, keeps performing the practice forever, waiting for a relief that never quite settles, because they never realized the entire point of the structure was to dissolve itself eventually into something that no longer requires performing at all. Ask yourself honestly, which piece of this shape you can already recognize operating somewhere in your own life right now, even faintly, even in an early and unreliable form. You do not need to have mastered all 5 angles of the same motion to have genuinely started.
A single moment last week where you noticed a rising frequency instead of simply being swept by it counts as real evidence, not a small consolation prize handed out for partial effort. The wave does not need to be fully understood to already be moving differently than it once did. Here is a distinction worth holding at this consolidated stage, because it prevents a mistake many people make once they can finally see the whole shape. Seeing the mechanism clearly is not the same as having mastered it completely. You will, almost certainly, still lose your temper sometimes. You will still have a season of depletion, where the old groove reasserts itself with more force than you expected. This does not mean the shape you have just seen was wrong. It means you are a living process, rather than a finished object. And living processes, by their nature, continue moving rather than arriving at a permanent, static state that never requires attention again. Think of the whole shape not as a destination you have now reached, but as a map you did not have before and now permanently do, one you can return to whenever the terrain feels unfamiliar again. A map does not walk the terrain for you. It does not remove the hills or the weather along the way. What it removes is the specific exhausting confusion of not knowing where you are, or why the terrain keeps producing the same difficulties in the same places. You now know why certain rooms disappoint you before you enter them. You know why certain evenings cost more than others. You know what a rising frequency feels like in the 2 seconds before it takes the wheel. And you know now that those 2 seconds were always the only place your hand could actually reach the mechanism. There is a quiet, undramatic confidence available at this stage, different from the sharp hope of the earlier chapters, and different too from any kind of arrival or completion. It is closer to the confidence of someone who has learned to read weather after years of being caught unprepared by it, someone who no longer treats every gathering cloud as a personal insult from an indifferent sky. The storms have not stopped. What has stopped is the specific helplessness of not knowing a storm was forming until it had already soaked you through. You can feel the pressure changing now, earlier than you ever could before, and that earlier noticing, however undramatic it looks from the outside, is the entire structure this book has been quietly building toward. One brick, one chapter, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, laid down long before you ever expected to notice the wall was standing. Chapter 15. No longer aimed at random. Go back for a moment to the dish. The one you were washing when this all began, already clean, rinsed for the 3rd time while a sentence from a man who is not in the room anymore, kept looping through you, unfinished, unresolved, renting space it had never been invited into. You have carried a version of that evening for a long time, maybe years, maybe your entire adult life, always assuming the lesson of it was simply that some people know how to hurt you, and some sentences are more powerful than others. Here is what was actually true that evening, and it has taken this entire book to earn the right to say it plainly. You were not weak in that kitchen. You were powerful in exactly the way this current has always made you powerful, and you aimed that power without meaning to, at the one sentence in the room instead of at anything you actually wanted. The current that kept the dish in your hands for 20 extra minutes was the same current that, aimed differently, builds a marriage that lasts 40 years, a body of work that outlives the person who made it, a family that feels safe enough to tell each other the truth. It was never a question of whether you had the power. You have had it the entire time. The only open question, the one this entire journey has been circling since its first paragraph, was where you were pointing it. This is the answer to the question that opened this book, the one it never let you fully see. The question was never what you do with your time. It was what you do with what remains of you after the time runs out, after the meeting disappoints you the way you expected, after the argument runs its familiar script, after the dread has already had its Sunday evening. What remains of you, in those depleted ordinary moments, is not a fixed quantity handed to you at birth and spent down passively across a lifetime. It is a current,
and a current can be aimed, and you now know, in a way you did not on the day you opened this book, exactly where the aiming happens. It happens in the half-second gap, the one this book kept returning to from a dozen different angles, calling it the millimeter, calling it the pause between a thought and a command, calling it the space between being the frequency and observing it. That gap was never small in the way it looked. It only felt small because nobody had ever pointed directly at it before and said, "Here your entire life bends around what you do inside this exact space, this precise and unglamorous half-second, available to you on every ordinary Tuesday whether or not you have ever noticed it until now." Think back, one more time, to the man in the kitchen, the one whose sentence you are, by now, allowed to have finally put down. He is not a villain in this story, any more than the pattern itself ever was. He said something careless, the way people do, running his own frequency, likely inherited from his own original room, aimed at you without much thought behind it at all. What happened next was never really about him, and it was about a current in you that had never been shown where else it might go. So it went, by default, toward the loudest available signal in the room. That is not a character flaw. It is simply what an unaimed current always does. It follows whatever is loudest, because loud is the only instruction it has ever been given. You have spent this book being given other instructions. Name the rising heat instead of being swept by it. Notice the substitute question before it spends your evening. Recognize the mirror instead of mistaking it for a window. Locate the room the pattern was actually built in. Attach the practice to a door that opens every day regardless of how you feel. Let repetition become identity, until the whole shape stops needing your conscious attention to keep running. None of these instructions were ever really separate techniques. They were 5 fingers of the same hand, learning slowly to reach for the one lever that was always technically available, and never, until now, actually visible. There is a final distinction worth making before this book lets you go, because it separates what has actually happened here from the kind of empty promise self-help so often makes. This was never a promise that your life would become easy, or that the current would simply stop running hot on the days it always ran hot. Ease was never the offer. What was offered quietly across 15 chapters was something closer to authorship. The difference between a current that runs through you unattended and a current you have learned, imperfectly but genuinely, to place your hand on. Authorship does not remove the weather. It changes who holds the pen when the weather arrives. Consider for a moment what happens to a person who never receives this particular kind of instruction at all, who lives an entire life with real force running through them and never once learns where the gap sits. They do not become weak. They remain exactly as powerful as you have always been. Current running at full strength for 80 years, aimed entirely by whatever happens to be loudest in any given room. A sentence here, a slight there, a Sunday dread compounding quietly across 4 decades. This is the actual tragedy this book has been circling from its very first paragraph. Not weakness, never weakness, but power spent entirely by accident. A life every bit as forceful as the one you are building now, simply never aimed anywhere on purpose. Here is the certainty this final chapter owes you, different in kind from every open question the rest of this book has left you holding. You are not broken, and you were never broken. Not on the evening with the dish, not in any of the evenings since. You are, and have always been, a generator of real force, running continuously, whether you have been aiming it deliberately or not. The only thing that has changed across these 15 chapters is that the aiming is no longer accidental. You know now where the gap sits. You know what your own oldest patterns are protecting, and why they are not enemies. You know that a bad week is a tide, not a verdict, and that a small structure, kept faithfully, outlasts a large intention abandoned by the second Tuesday. This does not mean the current stops being strong. It means finally that you are the one holding the other end of it. The next time a sentence lands somewhere behind your ribs, in a kitchen, at a dinner table, In a meeting that goes exactly as badly as you expected, you will feel the old current rise the way it always has. But you will also feel something that was not available to you before this book. A half-second of space, thin and real, wide enough for a different hand to reach the wheel before the old one takes it by default. You were never the dish, endlessly rewashed, or the sentence, endlessly replayed. You were always the current underneath both of them, patient, immense, and finally, after everything this book has shown you, no longer aimed at random.